Andy Slaughter.
I start by saying what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship, Mr. Weir, and also by congratulating the Honourable Member for Cambridge for securing the debate, but also on a very thorough and persuasive speech. It's now 6 months. It was November last year that the Minister first produced his proposals to restrict the scope and availability of legal aid, and a lot has happened since then. This is in fact our third debate on the issue in this House, and I know he's debated it outside with others, including my noble friend Lord Bark, and the other places debating the matter again next week. So many of the arguments should be familiar to the Minister. What I think we haven't had so far is any effective response to those. And I mentioned the members who have spoken today, because I think what we have seen today is from all sides of the House, people who are committed but understand the importance of legal aid in our system. So among many good points the member for Cambridge made, the point on viability, or whether these cuts will actually leave a viable legal aid service at all. And the point from her experience that my honourable friend the member for Makerfield made, that telephone advice, however important, cannot be the only entry point to the system, and that the alternative provisions that have been suggested are not adequate and have said themselves, those alternative provisions suggested by the government, to the tasks that have been set them. And the honourable member for South Swindon, who I think has nailed the allegation that we are hugely expensive in this country in relation to legal aid, proportionate to the cost of the legal system here, as he says. Legal aid spending, although it clearly has to be restrained, we have had false arguments, I think, that it is so disproportionate to what happens in other jurisdictions. And the Honourable Member for Merrion, who has more experience, I think, than any other members here, who urged, and I think this perhaps is the key point coming out of this debate, for the Minister to think more slowly and more carefully, and to make the decision not in the way that it has been portrayed so far, in a rushed way, but in a way that takes account of all those views that have been expressed. And of course my own friend, the member for Islington North, who talked about housing, a subject very dear to my own heart as well, and the effect that will have on our constituents in London, and the honourable member for Carshalton and Wallington, who talked about the false economies which there will be in making the cuts to legal aid. They may be familiar arguments, but they're arguments which I think the Minister needs to give answers to today, and particularly when he gives his response. He's also had the benefit of the Justice Select Committee's report, which took evidence from senior judges, the Minister himself, leaders in civil society, and criticised the lack of any evidential basis in his proposals. On issue after issue, from the increase in litigants in person, to the additional cost to the public purse, to the inability of alternative providers to pick up the pieces should his proposals come into force, the Select Committee told the Minister to slow down, to do some research, and then come back with revised proposals. Other organisations, particularly practitioner organisations, have done the work which the Minister and his civil servants haven't done in providing evidence of the effect of the changes. And I mentioned particularly the Legal Action Group, which took the original figure of 500,000 and showed, my old friend Felix North said, over 600,000. When one adds in the most up-to-date figures from the last financial year and the telephone advisory service that is there at the moment, the figure is actually near 725,000. That's almost 50% more than the government initially said. The Legal Aid Practitioners Group has taken this point on viability in looking at the fact that the entry point has to be through telephone advice. That has these disincentives. Firstly, many people will not be able to cope with that system. They rely on face-to-face advice. They will simply not access the system at all. But if we rely on that system, the broken down figures taken by local authority area show that the reduction in the service that can be provided face-to-face will be down to something like 7 to 10% of existing levels. That's not a sustainable level. If I take it purely as an example, but if you looked at my own borough, Hampton and Fulham, you'd go from 1,600 case starts at present to 155 under the new system. 155 matter starts would not be sufficient to pay one person's salary for a year. And if that is replicated across local authority areas, you don't have a service there at all. The Law Centres Federation has looked at the impact of cuts that have already taken place. So that includes local authority cuts, which are 53% in law centres, 61% in London, 100% in my own case. These ought to be taken into consideration before any legal aid cuts are put into effect, because they take effect from this financial year. And as has already been mentioned, the CAB, through the survey of its own members, has shown that more than 50% of those do not believe they will be financially viable once the cuts take effect. I do ask the Minister to listen to those voices that are hugely experienced and hugely articulate in that case. I think the Labour governments over the last 65 years have had a good record in setting up the legal aid system, in funding the first law centres, in increasing spending on both advisory services like citizens' advice, but also on social welfare legal aid. But we also restricted the growth in legal aid funding. We were doing that from 2003 onwards, and we will continue to do that. And I'm at a loss to understand why the government has abandoned some of the plans which we had to further restrict that growth, particularly in the tendering process, and particularly in the criminal legal aid field. Social welfare legal aid is only 5% of the total legal aid budget, and I hope that that is an area that the Minister is giving a lot of scrutiny to in deciding on revisions to his plans. I believe that removing social welfare legal aid from scope will give the whip hand to large public and private corporations. It will allow an inequality of arms that's unacceptable in the civil and criminal justice systems in this country. The other point that I would like to deal with briefly is who is affected most by this. The Minister said previously that, yes, it's inevitable that poorer people will be affected because it's poorer people who are in receipt of legal aid, but I think that's a slightly glib answer, if I may say so. The brief that was prepared for today by the young legal aid lawyers, which I think is an excellent brief, and drills down into those figures, shows that were the current proposals introduced, 44% of people who received representation last year and 68% of those who got legal help would not now receive that help. But 80%, more than 80% of those people who would lose assistance are in the poorest fifth of the population. The eligibility changes, which not a lot has been said about, but are also highly significant. Again, 80% of those who will be affected by those are in the poorest fifth of the population. When one looks at the discriminatory effects of what the Minister is proposing, 31% of those affected by the scope changes in housing are black and minority ethnic population, compared with 8% of the general population. 63% of those affected by the scope changes to benefit and welfare legal aid are disabled, compared with 18% in the general population. The Minister may say it's a truism, but his government should be ashamed that changes of that kind are being proposed and the disbenefit it will have. And it is a myth either that representation is not going for legal purposes, it is somehow going for general advice. It is not. It's going for the understanding of quite complex legal issues and for appeals to higher courts. Or that the people who are currently benefited are in a position to represent themselves. Now, the Minister has heard, and I want to stop now because I want to give him the opportunity to reply. The Minister has heard from all sides of the House, I think very eloquent speeches from his own side, of people who have had many years of experience of this. There is a growing call in the country, and I notice that Joanna Lumley has joined the campaign as well, which should give him pause for thought given her previous track record on these matters. When he finally comes to respond to the 5,000, that is an increase for the 50 responses to the last Labour government's consultation on legal aid. And I don't expect, obviously, to get a full response today. I hope that he will have considered, even if he hasn't read everyone individually, what the overwhelming weight of opinion is in relation to the effect that this will have. Yes, on very vulnerable people. Yes, on those of us who still try to provide an advice service with very limited means. But on the whole criminal and civil justice system in this country, which is in jeopardy if we take away access to justice, and if we remove the right of anybody who has a meritorious case to get the initial advice, but also the representation and assistance of bringing their case to court. That's not, I hope, something which the Minister, with his background, would wish to see. And I hope he will give an indication in his response today, and a fuller indication when we have that formal response, and no doubt he will provide the date of that when he responds now, that the government has been listening to all those voices, and that it will respond with a more sympathetic and a more pragmatic attitude to the continuation of legal aid in this country.